The Club World Cup exposed this Real Madrid side's future. They're either going to make history or die trying. Xabi Alonso used 3 different formations in 5 matches, more tactical changes than we saw under Ancelotti in years. Each adjustment was designed to solve a problem from the prior match, yet each solution created new vulnerabilities, while revealing flashes of genius that show why Madrid could go on to be unstoppable. Let's break down exactly what Alonso discovered about his team and whether Madrid's tactical chaos is the key to their evolution or the beginning of their downfall. What do you notice in these 3 scenarios? Despite starting in completely different formations, Alonso builds up the same way every time, with a back 3. And this back 3 is the foundation to everything Alonso is aiming to do with Real Madrid. And it all starts with Thibaut Courtois. Under Ancelotti, Courtois was mainly a traditional goalkeeper who rarely ventured beyond his penalty area, but this will change under Alonso. The Belgian has steadily been improving his ball-playing ability throughout his career, but it's clear that under Alonso, he'll have to take this to the highest level it's ever been. As whenever Madrid are building up from deep, if they begin with a back 4, he has to push up between the centre-backs to create that vital 3. Why does Alonso like doing this? Simple mathematics. By using Courtois as an active outfield player, Alonso doesn't have to drop an outfield player deep to create the initial numerical superiority. This extra man can instead push higher up the pitch where he can actually hurt the opponent. But of course, as the ball moves far enough upfield, Courtois can't be expected to continue to push high up, and this is where a truly fascinating dynamic begins to emerge. Football is an endless cycle of having a tactical plan, the opponent adapting to that plan, and then having to change that initial plan once again. Every move creates a counter move. The moment your tactics become predictable is the moment they become obsolete. Madrid's initial move in that debut encounter against Al Hilal showed Alonso has a clear aim regardless of the tactical system that he uses. In possession, they were rarely ever in a midfield 3, and that's because Trent Alexander-Arnold was inverting into the midfield, either into this zone or slightly higher up the pitch. This created a 4-man midfield, the exact same number of midfielders present when Real started with a diamond by default, with no inversion from the fullbacks. This now reveals a crucial truth about Alonso as a tactician. The starting shapes are always just a platform for his sides to express similar tactical principles. Formations are just the vocabulary. Principles are the language of his football. And the principle on display here is Alonso's desire for having a central overload, usually a 4 versus 3, so that Madrid have the option to take the most direct route to goal. But opponents, of course, have anticipated this, meaning almost every single team that Madrid faced was looking to defend in an extremely compact and narrow shape, usually with a front 2 to make playing through the center as difficult as possible. This brings us on to why Alonso insists on building in a back 3. The back 3 means that if the opponent's front 2 do try to press his centre-backs, the third man allows them to have an easy outlet outside of that pressure. But the personnel in the back 3 completely changes how that back 3 operates. The who is just as important as the what. In that same encounter against Al Hilal, where we saw Trent inverting into the midfield, Fran Garcia was also inverting here, so that he was the third man as the left centre-back. And he did a fine job from there, keeping things relatively simple. But the problem was, with the centre so well protected, Madrid didn't just need fine, simple passes. They needed something that could break these narrow, compact blocks to get Los Blancos on the front foot. But Fran Garcia's biggest strength is not found in his passing ability at all. In fact, the Fran Garcia problem is actually a bigger issue than it first appeared, especially when Madrid were using the diamond or the back 5, because in both of these systems, Fran Garcia was not expected to invert at all, but instead stay wide. And this caused major issues, because in the diamond and the back 5, he often found himself isolated. The tournament revealed that this is a situation that Madrid should aim to avoid at all costs. Whenever he received the ball in these areas, opponents immediately identified him as the weakness. As soon as he got on the ball, the opponent press suddenly kicked into high gear, looking to apply as much pressure on him as possible. He was the press trigger. And with good reason. Under pressure, he looked shaky and nervous, often just about getting out of a dangerous situation, and more often than not, playing it safe and going backwards, especially as he had no easy support option ahead of him. If it wasn't clear already before the tournament, Alonso's evolutions follow a clear path. Identify a weakness, find a solution, discover a new problem, and look to adapt again. And with opponents having identified Fran Garcia as the weakness, the adaptation for Alonso involved a slight tweak in the role of Vinicius Jr. Initially, when Garcia received, Vinicius was more central, but as the tournament progressed, Fran Garcia on the ball was a signal for Vinicius to immediately move wide in support. This could pin the fullback deep to give the left back more time on the ball to think, as most opponents were reluctant to commit a central man to press Garcia due to Madrid's central overload. But even if Garcia was still under pressure, at least now he had a simpler option up the line. The Vinicius solution helped when Garcia was isolated out wide. But what about when Garcia was the left centre-back, expected to progress from deeper positions? Well, this is where Alonso's next tweak emerged, and it's actually one of the reasons he switched to a dedicated back three. See, when Madrid built in a back four, the inversion meant that Huijsen ended up being the central centre-back. But in a dedicated back three, he could start and remain as the left centre-back. From this position, he quickly proved that he belongs at this level, showing the composure and passing range that Garcia lacked, meaning that he could play those penetrating passes into the centre to allow the Madrid midfield advantage to take hold. But there was still one crucial issue. Just like when Fran Garcia was inverting, Madrid in these situations still just had a back three, and the facts had not changed. Teams were still defending narrowly, and Real Madrid needed to get outside of that. So the back three did not remain static, and in possession, Huijsen would move into these pseudo left-back zones, and this completely changed the Madrid dynamic. Huijsen, when he received, was an excellent ball carrier, extremely comfortable with the ball at his feet, so he would be able to push higher up the pitch to get the ball into areas where he could potentially find the creative players in their most effective zones. The knock-on effect was huge. Garcia was no longer stuck deep where his weaknesses were exposed. Instead, he could play higher up the pitch where his greatest strength, his pace and running ability, actually mattered. With Vinicius often drifting wide or into the half spaces to draw defenders, Garcia found space to make overlapping runs that suited his game perfectly. The dedicated back three solved the Garcia problem perfectly, but it only worked when Madrid could use a back three, and this created a new puzzle when they needed to play the diamond formation. And to understand how Alonso looked to solve this puzzle, we must briefly talk about Trent's evolution in this system. Like we touched on, in the opening match, we saw this shape from Real Madrid, but one of the issues was Tchouaméni and Valverde have many strengths and aren't bad passers by any means, but Madrid needed more thrust from these deep pivot positions because the likes of Trent and Bellingham high up in the half spaces just weren't seeing enough of the ball in these zones. So later on in that encounter, Trent and Valverde began to rotate more often allowing the Englishman to see more of the ball and dictate the passing and hopefully be able to find these men between the lines. But as Alonso moved away from the 4-3-3, both the diamond and the back five are quite narrow shapes, with complete dependence on the fullbacks to provide all of the width. This meant that there was no more inversion from Trent into the midfield, or even potentially as a third centre-back. So how could Alonso look to form his back three instead? That moves us onto the new look role of Arda Guler. But most of his career, he has operated either as an attacking midfielder, out wide, or at a push as a central midfielder. But as we saw with the Tchouaméni-Valverde double pivot, ball progression into the dual 10s could become an issue, especially with Trent no longer inverting and Bellingham increasingly being asked to stay higher up the pitch. Enter Guler in this completely transformed role. Rather than operating as a 10 waiting to get on the end of progressive passes, the Turk has taken it upon himself to become Real Madrid's primary deep playmaker, dropping into this pivot position. He is quickly becoming the hub that everyone looks to find deep, due to his ability to play on the half turn, and where before his passing ability centered around threading passes into the forwards, he is now using that same ability to break the lines. To put it simply, he is taking on the Toni Kroos role. And here's where things get really interesting. He has taken on another Kroosism, and this is by dropping even deeper in the build-up and often off to the left-hand side of the backline. So now, when Real Madrid start with the diamond, Arda Guler is the third man in that initial build-up phase, still allowing Madrid to have that 3 versus 2. And the end result is the same. They now have a great on-the-ball player playing off the left-hand side to do all of the progression on that side of the pitch. Since adopting this deeper role, Guler has been largely successful, but his evolution has created a new tactical puzzle for Alonso, one that becomes apparent when we examine what's happening down Real Madrid's right flank. As we discussed, this new narrow shape has meant that Trent now has to stay out wide. But one of Madrid's biggest attacking strategies follows the overload to isolate principle. This is where the team floods one side of the pitch to force the opponent across and create space on the far side for a switch to allow a man to take advantage. And this showed potential in Madrid's first match, where they used a 4-3-3 that turned into a midfield box with Trent inverted. So when the switch came, Rodrigo, a natural winger, potentially had space for that 1 versus 1 to do damage. But Alonso's tactical evolution created an unexpected problem. When Madrid switched to a diamond or a back 5, Trent no longer had a winger ahead of him. Now, when they executed their signature switch of play, it was Trent receiving the ball in wide areas rather than a natural dribbler like Rodrigo. This fundamentally changed Madrid's attacking dynamic. Trent is world-class on the ball, but not because of his dribbling ability or his pace in 1v1 situations. When he receives these switches, unless he's crossing immediately, he's not being utilized at his effective best. This trend of Trent being isolated created more problems even when Madrid were initially beginning the build-up play down the right-hand side, as we've seen 2 distinct versions of Madrid when they're building down this flank. In scenario 1, Trent receives the ball in his traditional right-back position, looks up and faces immediate pressure with no support ahead of him. Unlike the left side, where Vinicius is happy to move into his natural wide position, the primary right-sided forward in this tournament, Gonzalo Garcia, preferred to stay central. This left Trent isolated, and even elite passers need people to make passes too. Unfortunately, often during the tournament, Trent did not have that luxury. But scenario 2 showed why Los Blancos could be so much more dangerous. Bellingham and Valverde held the keys to shifting the dynamic completely. In the diamond, Bellingham had this much freer role, and when he recognized these occasions, he would make a dart through the right-hand half space ahead of Trent. Valverde, also from the diamond, but more often from the right of the midfield 3, when they operated with the back 5, would make similar runs, and that changed things completely, with defenders either being dropped deeper to deal with the run, thus giving Trent more space and time on the ball to express his passing range. Or, if they still insisted on pressing Trent, now he had a man in the half space that he could look to find with a pass, and this could begin to drag defenders across, making the opponent's defensive structure more vulnerable. So that's how Madrid looked in the build-up and when attacking through the width, but it's worth briefly talking about the role of Bellingham. Regardless of the shape, he tends to be the midfielder given the most freedom and, as a result, the most responsibility in the final third. This involves linking up the play between the midfield and the forwards, but also crashing into the box, especially when Vinicius or Mbappe go drifting. But this creates its own challenge, which is consistently getting the ball to Bellingham in these dangerous positions. With teams already stacking the center against Madrid, Guler's line-breaking ability from deep becomes absolutely crucial to the entire system functioning, as that's the only way to get Bellingham on the ball. In summary, Madrid's possession play is beginning to show real promise, but is far from perfect. Alonso has demonstrated a clear pattern: identify a weakness, implement solutions, and adapt to the new problems that emerge. Each tactical evolution serves a purpose, but every solution brings new challenges. But if Madrid's possession system shows promise despite its flaws, their defensive structure tells a completely different story. One of systematic failure that threatens everything Alonso is trying to build. Because perfect possession is pointless if you can't win the ball back to use it. And if you've gotten this far into the video, you're probably a true tactical nerd. And if you've ever wanted to understand the tactical principles that allow elite teams to function, I've put together a free resource to get you started on your tactical analysis journey. Just click the top link in the description or the comments. Again, Alonso used 3 different formations, but every single opponent found the same weakness in Madrid's press. And that's not coincidence, it's evidence of a pressing system that is fundamentally broken, because consistent failure isn't bad luck, it's a sign of poor tactical design. And this system is so broken, in fact, that if Alonso doesn't sort it out, it could ruin their season. So what's the difference between this, where Real Madrid ensnare Dortmund and win the ball back immediately, shows everything wrong with Madrid's defensive approach? For every goal kick, Alonso wants his team pressing extremely high up the pitch to win the ball back in dangerous areas. And regardless of the formation, the pressing shape has looked almost identical. A front 2 immediately applying pressure on the centre-backs, a midfielder picking up the opposition pivot, and 2 players positioned narrow to cover the central zones, but also ready to press the wide regions. In that debut match using the 4-3-3, this meant that the attacking midfielder Bellingham pushed up to support the forward, and another midfielder, Valverde, had to advance from deep, and both wingers tucked inside. On paper, it looked perfect. The setup had obvious advantages. The front 2 could pounce the moment the goalkeeper released the ball, forcing the play wide early. From there, the wingers were perfectly positioned to press the fullbacks, creating a suffocating trap across the entire width of the pitch. A deadly combination when it worked. Because again, tactics are a game of sacrifices. To gain a strength, there's a good chance that you make a sacrifice by introducing a new weakness. And this shape introduced an absolutely glaring one. Here's the problem. To create that aggressive frontline press, Madrid had to sacrifice midfield numbers. With a midfielder joining the forward and another pushing up to mark the pivot, they looked dangerously light in the central zones. Something, of course, that Inzaghi was quick to spot. A couple of passes would immediately find an Al Hilal man in the space between Madrid's aggressive front line and their depleted midfield. Suddenly, Real had committed 5 players to winning the ball and gained nothing. Well, even worse, because now those men were completely out of position. Like we said, the weakness between the lines was glaring, so Alonso looked to adapt in subsequent matches when he was now in the diamond and the back 5. Having a natural front 2 in both cases would mean there was no longer a need for a midfielder to join the frontline press, allowing them to hypothetically maintain more numbers in the midfield. But now a new problem emerged. Who was picking up the fullbacks? The solution from Alonso in the diamond was to commit the wider midfielders into these tucked positions, where they could help cover the center in case the opponent switched to a double pivot, but could also immediately press in the wider zones. So the pressing personnel were different to the 4-3-3, but the end shape was eerily similar. And this meant that the same weakness was still present. And now, because the wide pressers were starting much narrower initially than the wingers, when the opposition fullback got the ball, they had more time to get their head up. I mean, look at this situation against PSG. It's open play, but the same principles apply. The front 2 on the back 2, and a narrow, higher Real Madrid midfield 3. But now when the fullback receives, the midfielder has to come across. And you can already see a similar issue emerging. Plenty of room is now present between the lines. And Salzburg, in their narrow 4-2-2-2, found a similar situation, where with a single pass, they could get goal side of 3 of the 4 Real Madrid midfielders. An absolute disaster. But if they are so poor in the goal kick press, why did they consistently get into positions like this and like this? Well, what do you notice when you look at these two lineups? This zone here is crucial and changed the dynamic of the press completely. See, when Dortmund were building up from the deeper zones, they looked like this. More or less, on the pitch, they had a similar shape to what they had on paper. And Real Madrid actually did not change their press structure at all. The matchup instead just naturally played into their hands. When a midfielder went to support the forwards by being the man to press in the wider regions, the starting 4 versus 3 advantage meant that even with the midfielder now pushing higher up, they still had a man-to-man situation in the midfield, meaning that now the Dortmund defender was not only looking to make a pass under pressure, it was into a midfielder who was already closely attended. The result was predictable, and Madrid's press looked imperious. But here's the thing, anyone who watched Alonso's Madrid at this tournament knows that their press was anything but imperious. But to give context as to why, let's have a brief detour to talk about perception in football. What did these players have in common? Well, they are a genre of player where whenever they played well, the public were quick to lavish praise on them. How they made the game look easy, played the game the right way, and they were special players. But if those players had the exact same performance, but their team happened to lose, they were suddenly labeled as lazy and unwilling to contribute to the side defensively. And maybe there was some truth to this at times. However, the important thing here is that Real Madrid might find themselves in a similar situation. When they win this season, the narrative will be simple. How do you stop a team with Mbappe, Vinicius, Bellingham and co? It's simply impossible to defend against that much talent, etc, etc. But the moment they lose, the story will flip instantly. Ego-driven superstars who can't be bothered to track back. And this narrative has already started at the Club World Cup. The lazy analysis goes like this. Real Madrid are weak defensively solely because Vinicius and Mbappe can't be bothered to defend. But is this actually true? Well, what do you see in these scenarios? A lot of pressing, but also the two actual biggest issues with Madrid in the press. These are the two formations that Madrid use most often at the Club World Cup, and they have one thing in common. Their high shape is extremely narrow, meaning that from both of these formations, they're experiencing the exact same issues. It's either a midfielder pushing out too late to make a difference and leaving them exposed in the midfield. But sometimes the issue isn't the initial shape of the press, it's the complete lack of coordination once that press begins. This is where Real Madrid's real problems become apparent. We've seen countless instances where one or two forwards begin pressing aggressively, only to find themselves completely isolated. The midfield doesn't follow, and the rest of the front line doesn't commit. The press becomes a half-hearted, disjointed mess. This lack of coordination is understandable. I mean, they've barely played together under the new manager, but the consequences were devastating. When only part of the team presses, you get the worst of both worlds. The forwards who do commit are now completely removed from the game, stranded high up the pitch as the opponents play around them. Meanwhile, Madrid are left numerically underloaded in the midfield, creating massive gaps between the lines. And opponents have learned to exploit this ruthlessly. They bait the partial press, wait for Madrid's forwards to commit, then play simple passes into the space behind them. Suddenly, they have players running at Madrid's defense with time and space to create danger. And let's get this right, Vinicius and Mbappe are no angels when it comes to the press or defending in general. But often, at times, at the Club World Cup at least, the issue was that the team did not press or sit back as a unit, rather than Mbappe or Vinicius being the only problem. So this meant that the entire pressing scheme suffered a complete systematic breakdown that went far beyond individual effort. And it happened consistently across different formations and personnel combinations. But when you do combine these coordination failures with personnel mismatches, you get the perfect storm of defensive vulnerability. Playing Arda Guler so deep has been a revelation in possession, with the young Turk doing his best Kroos impression as Real Madrid's deep-lying playmaker. But there's a crucial difference. Kroos had a peak Casemiro alongside him, a midfielder who could cover enormous amounts of ground and provide the defensive steel that allowed Kroos to focus on his passing. Guler doesn't have that luxury yet. As he adjusts to this new role, he's proving vulnerable in defensive situations. Opponents are getting on the wrong side of him, receiving between the lines in the most dangerous positions where they can turn and drive at Madrid's defense, from scenarios where Guler should have been more aware. That, paired with the backline being hesitant to back up the press at times, has compounded issues. PSG showed how to exploit both the structural and personnel issues perfectly. Remember how Madrid's press had looked effective against Dortmund's midfield three? Well, PSG were also using a midfield 3, so why were they so dominant against that same diamond system? While PSG's solutions were surgical. They built up in a back 3 against Madrid's front 2, instantly creating an advantage there. But the key insight was that initially, Nuno Mendes was that left centre back. With no pressure on him, and Madrid being naturally so narrow, Mendes could easily find Kvaratskhelia in 1v1 situations against the right back, whom he could look to take advantage of. But PSG could actually take things a step further, most notably looking to manipulate Guler. When Vitinha dropped deep to collect the ball, he dragged Guler with him higher up the pitch. Vitinha could then rotate with Mendes, meaning that Mendes would now be the free man between the lines, but now he had even more space as Guler was drawn high, and he could now receive closer to Madrid's defensive line and look to cause problems. Meanwhile, PSG's flexible front 3 constantly dropped between the lines, creating the same overload problems that had plagued Madrid all tournament. Kvaratskhelia and the other forwards would drift into the midfield zones, leaving Madrid's defenders in no man's land, too deep to press and too isolated to defend. The pattern repeated against every opponent, except when they had a dedicated defensive midfielder like Tchouaméni in the midfield. Against Juventus, initially with Tchouaméni in the backline, Yildiz ran riot, until Alonso in the second half moved Tchouaméni from the back 5 into the center of the midfield, and that immediately stabilized defensive structure, and may point to the future solution for Alonso. But in general, an uncomfortable truth was revealed. Madrid's pressing system is poorly coordinated, and as a result is being systematically dismantled by opponents who understand exactly how to exploit it. So Madrid's attacking potential is limitless, but their defensive structure is a disaster waiting to happen. The key is for Alonso to fix it.